Hola y'all, it's Michelle and you are watching Shelly Flowers Reads and Writes, my channel where I talk all things related to books, writing, teaching, and parenting and everything else that comes in between. So today I am going to do my actual very first BookTube Newbie Tag. I started this channel, I already have a few videos up, but I realized I didn't actually do the newbie tag because I didn't know that was a thing. So shout out to Books and BS for nominating me for this tag, and I'm excited to kind of join the conversation a little bit. Okay, so first of all, question one, why did you start this channel? I talked about this in my very first video, but just to kind of elaborate on what I said in that video, the main reason that I decided to start this channel was because I had been watching BookTube for a few months. I actually started back in December, and I think the first booktuber to really catch my eye was Read with Cindy. Obviously she's extremely popular. She just started her channel like about a year and a half ago as well. But what I loved about her channel was just how authentic she was in all of her videos, how funny and analytical her mind works. And so I thought, watching her channel, seeing how different she was compared to other booktubers, I could also contribute in a way that might not match necessarily what other booktubers are doing, which will then make a much richer landscape of what we've got going on here on YouTube. I also did not see as many Latinx booktubers participating when I first started watching, and it's mainly because I didn't know how to find them. So now that I know about the Latinx booktuber tag, which I do plan on doing, I am excited to connect more and hear from more perspectives that are both similar to mine and very different from mine. Question two, what are some fun and unique things you can bring to BookTube? Okay, so this I think is really where my perspective is really different from most people that are on BookTube at the moment. I read a genre that most people don't read. I read poetry, and I did a whole video about poetry and some books I've recommended if you are looking to get into the genre but you're not sure where to start. So you can go ahead and check that. I'm gonna link it in the description down below. But I just personally think if you are someone who has always been curious about poetry or you don't know anything about poetry, I would highly recommend watching my channel because I read poetry constantly. I write poetry all the time, and it's my favorite genre in the world. So I just think there isn't that much conversation about it. There are a few booktubers who I've seen who've talked about it, and a few AuthorTubers as well. I'm linking their YouTube pages down below so you can check them out. But I just think overall poetry is kind of going through this renaissance period right now, and it's becoming more and more popular. So I think I could be really helpful in terms of guiding people towards finding actual poetry that they might enjoy. I also have an AuthorTube perspective. I am a published author. This is my book right here, Cuentos from the Swamp. And my experience being published in poetry, it's vastly different from being published in fiction, no matter the type of fiction, because not as many people read poetry compared to fiction. And so I can provide a little bit of perspective in that sense, and I can also talk about the academic portions of things. I have an MFA. I got my MFA in poetry. I'll be doing a video about that in the next coming weeks. So I really just wanted to use some of my expertise in a way that maybe hasn't exactly been touted here on YouTube. What are you most excited about for this new channel? So I'd say the main thing that I am excited about is talking about books, of course. I read a lot compared to most of the people that are in my life, and I don't really have anyone to talk to about the books that I read. And so it's exciting to just get the chance to read a lot of books, talk about them. I feel like I'm excited again to read in a way that I haven't been in the past few years. So getting the chance to talk about books and connect with people about the books that I'm reading is just something that I'm really looking forward to. I think another big thing that I'm very excited about is, you know, just watching my channel and seeing how it grows. I have never been one who's been so big on social media in terms of trying to be an influencer or anything like that. I've always been much more about building organic connections and, you know, meeting people in a much more authentic way, and that's kind of how I'm viewing this channel. It's not necessarily for me to blow up and become like a big YouTube celebrity or anything like that. I mean, I probably wouldn't have picked BookTube if I wanted to do that. But I do think it's a great way for me to lend some of the resources that I've garnered over the years and to guide people into different writing styles and, you know, again, just pulling out different books that you might not have considered for your TBR, but something that should be on your mind. Okay, the next question is a really interesting question. Why do you love reading? So I have two answers to this question, really, because my reason for loving reading has actually changed over the years. When I was a kid, reading for me was pure escape. I grew up in a really strict Cuban-American household. However, I was raised Pentecostal. So I had these two very different worlds tugging at me. And a lot of time that tension, that cognitive dissonance was just like a lot for me to handle. So books were my escape. I preferred science fiction and YA fantasy at the time. And I really just used books as a way to not have to connect with the people around me, to not have to deal with the stuff that I was going through. It was just my escape. As an adult, though, my reasons for reading have really shifted. I read for emotional connection now. That's the main reason why I love poetry so much, is because it focuses on building that emotional connection with the reader. I am particularly interested in reading stories that I just didn't have access to when I was a kid. Nowadays, I feel like the literary landscape is just so diverse, and every week, every day, we're seeing more and more perspectives being added into the canon. When I was coming up, there really weren't that many stories about Cuban-American girls who were living in the United States, you know? And now I can think of like 2 or 3 books that came out within the past few years about being Cuban-American. So I just think overall, the landscape that we're living in right now is so different than how it was from when I was a kid, and I can see so much more of myself in the books that I'm reading in a way that I never really could when I was a kid. The next question is kind of tied into this past one. Number 5, what book or series got you into reading? So I think my answers are pretty typical for a lot of people on BookTube, but there were 2 main series that got me into reading. The first one was this sci-fi series called Animorphs. I haven't heard too many people talk about Animorphs on BookTube because it's a very like 90s niche kind of book series, but seriously, this book like changed my life. It was so controversial for me to be reading this because, like I said before, I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and the books dealt a lot with like things like alien invasion and evolution and all this kind of stuff that my church was just like, you can't be into this. I even remember one time when I was in 4th grade, I did a book report on one of the books, and it was like 3 pages long. I typed it out and everything. This was the early days of PCs, and I printed it out, and I was so excited because I was obsessed with this book. I think it was like the 3rd or 4th Animorphs book. It's the one with the purple cover. I do remember that. And my teacher sat me down and we had a conference, and she said, you cannot do a book report on this book. It is not allowed. It goes against our school guidelines. I went to a small Christian private school, so that's why it went against the school guidelines. And I was crushed. And I remember my mom being really upset as well. As religious as she was a firm believer that if I was reading, that was a good thing no matter what I was reading. So for her, she had a really hard time understanding why a school would want to prevent a child from reading. And that incident, I think, really taught me the power of books and the power of, 1, thinking for yourself, and 2, making sure that you are looking for the best decision for kids, not necessarily just the ones that fall in line with your ideology. So that was like a huge lesson for me. And then the next series, of course, was Harry Potter. Now, the funny thing with reading Harry Potter was that I actually did not like the first book when I started reading it. I remember it was in my teacher's classroom. I picked it up, I read the first chapter, and I was like, this is so boring. Like, I get that Harry's going through a hard time right now, but like, I could care less. I don't understand anything that's happening in this book. And then a few months later, my mom actually bought me the first book on paperback. I was 11 years old at the time, and she bought it for me for Christmas. So I was like, well, I guess I gotta read it now. I got nothing else to do. It's winter break, and my mom's gonna be mad if she bought me this book and I didn't read it. So I went ahead and decided to read the book. And after finishing the first one, I was hooked. I loved the series. I was obsessed. I went to all the midnight magic parties. I went to all of the movie releases. I remember one year, I think it was when the 5th or 6th movie came out, My sister and my cousins and I, we all got dressed up in costume, went to the movie theater. They didn't even read the books. They just knew that I was so into it. They indulged me in that moment. So I would definitely say Animorphs is what piqued my interest as a reader. And then Harry Potter is what like solidified my love of reading. The next question is, what questions can you ask your favorite booktubers? So for me, I think my big question is, can we read some poetry together? Like, I think so often on BookTube when we talk about genres of things, it's always subgenres of fiction. And I find that really interesting because there's so much more to the literary landscape than just fiction. I'm not saying it to be judgmental, but it's more just a desire to want to expand people's literary landscapes. I think oftentimes poetry gets a really bad rap, and I completely understand why, because trust me, I've read plenty of bad poetry, but I also feel like there's a lot of bad fiction out and people still read fiction all the time. So for me, I think it would be interesting to see more poetry on BookTube and to see people look at things in terms of a more like metaphorical and emotional connection rather than just focusing on plot and characters and story elements of that nature. So next we have number 7. What challenges do you think starting a BookTube channel will be the hardest to overcome? So for me, I think, again, kind of tied into my previous answer, my main genre of choice is poetry, and not a lot of people read poetry, and not a lot of people talk about poetry on BookTube. So I think because I mention it so much, that might be something that holds my channel back a little bit. But I also am very much someone who believes in sticking to their guns and not trying to conform into what's necessarily popular or most talked about in the moment. Instead, I really just want to read the things that I want to read and talk about those things with anyone who will want to listen. I think another struggle is just going to be staying consistent with this. It's really easy right now for me to post one video a week because I don't have to go to a physical place of work right now. I normally work as a teacher, and that's like a 10-hour-a-day job at minimum. But right now, because I'm home all the time, it's a lot easier for me to balance out my own personal hobbies with the work I have to do for my school. I don't know if that's always going to be the case. And so I'm really hoping I can set up a schedule for myself where I can probably like mass record videos and make sure that I've got a few in the bank every single week. That way I'm not constantly trying to come up with new content. But, you know, making that consistent, especially when I am back at school and things are getting really hectic throughout the year, that'll be a challenge I will have to consider in the coming months for sure. Okay, so question 8. When did you start reading? I definitely started reading in preschool. I remember I had all of those like golden books that have the really pretty spines, and they're usually like Disney kind of books, and I was obsessed with those as a kid. And then I think, again, with Animorphs in 4th grade, that's when reading really became a hobby for me. And the next question, where do you read? So I read pretty much everywhere. I'm kind of like Rory Gilmore, if you've ever seen Gilmore Girls. She did this thing where she would bring a book with her everywhere she went, and I'm the same way. I have one anytime I go out, unless I'm going to like a bar or something like that. But even then, there's been times where after work I bring my book to the bar and I'm that old lady sitting with the martini at the bar, like just reading by myself, because sometimes you just need that martini and that book. But I also like to read when I'm outside. I have a little patio area that I'll just put my feet up and read there. I've started doing this new thing where I like to read in the tub, and I turn out all the lights, turn on a bunch of candles, play some ambient music in the background, and that is like such a great way to unwind after a really stressful week. So that is something I'm going to be doing more. But yeah, pretty much anywhere. On cars, planes, reading at the beach. That's another one of my favorite places to read. Any place I have time and space for it, I read. And our last question, what kind of books do you like to read? So, like I said before, I tend to read a lot of poetry. The other main genre that I'm also really enjoying lately is nonfiction. It's kind of crazy because I have never liked nonfiction, and this past year I have really pushed myself to read it more. I started by listening to it on audiobook, and then I started purchasing real nonfiction books, and now I find that as long as it's like a memoir or a more narrative structure to the nonfiction, I can read it like it's a fiction book or a book of poetry. If it's a more technical book or something that's giving a lot of information, I prefer it on audiobook because it's almost like a podcast to me. So those are my main two genres that I'm loving right now, nonfiction and poetry. I also read fiction, though not as much. Although at this time I'm kind of working on a possible middle grade like YA sort of novel, and so I do anticipate that I'll be reading more of that in the coming months. I tend to write in poetry and nonfiction the most, so that might be why I read poetry and nonfiction the most. I'm definitely someone who, like it says in my bio, I read about what I write and I write about what I read. So that's just like a constant cyclical thing for me in terms of my writing. Alright guys, so that's pretty much it for me. If you would like to follow me on a more day-to-day basis, you can follow me on Instagram at Shelly Flowers. I post more than just books. You see a lot of my family life, some stuff that I'm working on, things of that nature. If you are interested in reading poetry and you don't know where to start, I would go ahead and plug my own book of poetry, Cuentos from the Swamp. You can find it at Finishing Line Press. I'll put the link down below. You can also direct message me and I can mail you a signed copy myself, so just find me on Instagram to do that. And I hope you all stay safe. I would love to nominate someone, but I don't know anyone who's newer on BookTube than me right now. So if you happen to stumble upon this, tag yourself, enjoy. And I hope y'all stay safe, wash your hands. Ciao, y'all.